Okay, so that's a lot of Abraham material as we see it. So now dealing with the covenant with Abraham. Oops, whoa, where'd that come from? Don't want that. There. Okay, the remainder of the book of Genesis then is sort of the fleshing out and living out of the covenant with Abraham. We talked a little bit about the Sarah-Hagar struggle, Hagar being the mother of Ishmael, the slave girl of Sarah, Sarah being the wife of Abraham, and there was an enmity between the two of them, and ultimately Sarah has Abraham toss Hagar and Ishmael out. And then Ishmael becomes the ancestral father of the Ishmaelites, who Joseph is going to be sold to. I don't know if you realize that's the same thing. And then ultimately Ishmael is seen as being the ancestral father of the Arabs. One thing that people don't realize is that there are Arabs who appear in the Old Testament. And one of the groups that is at the Pentecost narrative are the Arabs. The last group that's mentioned, it says Cretans and Arabs too. And so that takes them all the way back to the time of Pentecost. Then we have the story of the birth of Isaac, which I spoke about again, where Sarah laughed, and Yitzhak is the Hebrew for she laughed. Then Isaac grows up, and there's a situation of trying to find a wife for Isaac, and so he sends to his uncle Laban, and ultimately Isaac marries Rebekah. And Isaac then has two children, Esau and Jacob. Esau becomes the ancestor of the Edomites. The Edomites who lived just south and I think a little bit east of Israel. And the Edomites were ultimately transformed into the Idumeans. And the great Idumean that we hear about is Herod the Great. And so he would be a descendant way down the line of Esau. Again, trying to put all these things together, Amos, in his prophecy, and again, this is where the early Old Testament helps the later Old Testament, and when you start reading the prophets and some of the prophetic works, Amos pulls a real interesting trick out. He starts off, for 3 crimes of Damascus and for 4 I will not revoke my word. Damascus, of course, being Syria. Then he goes on and says, for 3 crimes of Gaza and for 4 I will not revoke my word. Gaza being Philistia. For 3 crimes of Tyre and for 4. Tyre is Phoenicia. So those are 3 territories that are outside of the entire realm. Then he goes on, for 3 crimes of Edom and for 4. Now we've got a relative connected in. For 3 tribes of Ammon and 4. This is another relative. For 3 tribes of Moab and of 4. Yet another relative. So he gives 3 non-related groups, then 3 related groups. And of course, as you're hearing this, I can see the Israelites saying, yeah, get them. Well, then he gets past Moab and he says, for 3 crimes of Judah and for 4. And then I think they step back a bit like, wait a minute, this is getting a little close to home. And then the punchline, for 3 crimes of Israel and for 4. He hits them where it hurts. So notice, but you see, you need to know these connections of Esau and Edom and Moab and Ammon and so on to get what's going on in Amos as it fits together. Now I've got a big chart that puts all these people together for you coming, okay? But that's out of Edom. So Esau and Jacob. So Esau becomes the ancestor of the Edomites and Jacob receives the promise. And again, how does Jacob receive the promise? He tricks his father Isaac to get Esau. Esau is the elder. He tricks his father Isaac to get the blessing. He literally steals the blessing from Isaac, and hence he gets his name Yaakov, he who steals. Okay? Continuing on then, we have the famous story of Jacob now finding a wife. And of course this one it's very, very entailed in the book of Genesis. He goes to his uncle again, and he is actually interested in Rachel. But He works for 7 years, and the uncle gives him Leah, the one he didn't want. But he marries Leah and has Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, 6 boys. Then Leah gives him her maid, Zilpah, and with her he has Gad and Asher. Then, goes through the maids now, Rachel gives him her maid, Dan, and through her he has Dan and Naphtali. And finally, after all of this, he's given Rachel, the one he wanted in the beginning, to marry, and she becomes the mother of Joseph and Benjamin. And so we have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Dan, Naphtali, Joseph, and Benjamin, the 12 sons of Jacob. However, as time goes on, Joseph has 2 children, Ephraim and Manasseh. What basically happens here is these are the ones that go to Egypt. They experience the Exodus, they come back, and their descendants basically are now tribal, and so we have 12 tribes. And the land, when they come back, is divided among the descendants of these 12. However, Levi is the priestly tribe. Levi ends up being the tribe that ministers at the tent. They minister before God. And so since their place is before God, they're not given any land. Okay, there's a problem now. If Levi's not given any land, we've got 12 divisions, what do? Well, Joseph basically gets twice as much land because Joseph's land and Levi's land go to Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So, these names, minus Levi and Joseph, become the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, Levi, because he doesn't get land since he's sacred, and then Joseph drops out and his 2 sons come in place. So if you see lists now, you'll see lists of the 12 tribes of Israel, and there'll be various combinations of the names, etc. By the way, if you recall, we didn't read it on All Saints' Day last week, but they talk about the 144,000 who were sealed in the book of Revelation. The 144,000 sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel, and then they drop the names of the tribes, but the text actually goes on, and it lists the 12 tribes of Israel. By the way, sideline, some people say, are you among the 144,000? No. None of us are, I would tend to think. Well, then you're not saved. Well, none of us are saved then. Well, why do you say that? Because it says 144,000 from the 12 tribes of Israel. And then it proceeds to delineate 12,000 from each of the named tribes. I'm not from the tribes of Israel. Are you from the tribes of Israel? Well, then we're not saved. But we are. Because the text goes on to talk about an innumerable multitude of every tribe, nation, and tongue. So if somebody tries to tell you that there's only 144,000 saved, tell them they're all Jews. Tell them to read the book of Revelation. Okay. Again, why do I tell that? Because it's an interesting story, but also read the Bible. Because when you read the Bible, you know a lot more than the person who thinks they've read the Bible. And force them to show you where it says what they say it says. Because 9 times out of 10, they won't be able to. Okay. So after we have this, all the machinations with Isaac and so on, and Joseph with Jacob with his many concubines and wives and 12 sons, the center of attraction becomes the son of Jacob named Joseph. And Joseph is the envy of his brothers because he gets an amazing Technicolor dream coat. Okay. That's where, see again, You want to go to a Broadway play? You got to know your Old Testament. Hey, all this stuff shows up. Joseph seems to be his father's favorite, and as a result of that, he receives the enmity of his brothers, who plot to kill him, but instead sell him to a caravan of Ishmaelites. So descendants of their great uncle. Interesting. And he then ends up in the Egyptian court of Pharaoh, and he rises in the Egyptian court. Now, why is that so? In Egyptian history, there's the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. And between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, there was an invasion of a group of people called the Hyksos. Not the hiccups, but the Hyksos. And they were a Semitic type people, similar to Joseph and his brothers. And so if the Egyptian rule ends up under a Semitic type of people, it becomes possible for Joseph to rise in power. And he does. And gains a situation. And then a famine arises. Joseph has told the Egyptians to preserve the food, preserve the grain. And so there's grain in Egypt, there's not grain in Israel. Jacob sends his sons down to get something. Joseph meets them, hides his identity, demands that his full brother Benjamin be brought so he can see him. Jacob doesn't like that idea, but reluctantly allows it. And then Joseph reveals himself with the famous line that Cardinal Bernardine used the night that he came to Chicago to the priests, "I am Joseph, your brother." And then the brothers go down and they're confronted by Joseph, and basically then they bring ultimately their father and their whole family. So, Abraham's come into the land, Isaac's in the land, Jacob's in the land, so that's 3 generations, and all of a sudden the whole family up and gathers and goes down to Egypt because of a famine. The thing is, that stay in Egypt, which was prophesied in that statement of God to Abraham, ends up being 400 years. And so the descendants, continue there and the tribes grow. Okay, that's the end of the book of Genesis. Is Abraham or Jacob and his family in Egypt. The book of Exodus begins with there being a new king. So after this kind of interregnum period with these Hyksos types, the Egyptians reassert their power and a new king begins what's called the Middle Kingdom. That new king is one of the names I gave you earlier on, Sethi the First. And Sethi the first's son is Ramesses the Second, alias Yul Brynner. Ramesses the Second is probably one of the great building kings of Egypt. Okay, we've got great builders in our Old Testament history. Ramesses II is one of the great builders. Solomon, the king of Israel, is another great builder. Herod the Great is another great builder in terms of things. So right now we're looking at Ramesses, and Ramesses builds the supply cities of Pithom and Ramesses, and he needs labor to build the cities. And so he then enslaves the descendants of Jacob and makes them do his work for them. So the Hebrews have grown, and there's an enslavement of the Hebrews, but also then a decree whereby the eldest child or the male children of the Hebrew slaves are to be killed. It's one way of population control overall. And so basically, then Moses, who is the child of Miriam's the sister. What in the heck is his mother's name? Yoshabel. There we are. Yoshabel is put into a little basket and floated down the river. And the daughter of Pharaoh finds the basket and lifts him up. Masa is to lift up. The one who was picked up or lifted up out of the river is Moshe. and hence he gets his name, the one who was picked up, and is named Moses, and basically comes to live and rise in the Pharaoh's court. So Moses has some affinities with Joseph. Now, Moses has some affinities with Joseph as far as because both rise in Egypt in an Egyptian court. Okay, so now with all of this, let's look at this patriarchal family tree. Here's Terah, Abraham's father. And then Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, 3 brothers. Haran is the father of Lot. Lot's the one who's got the famous wife who turns into a pillar of salt. So Lot is Abraham's nephew, and Lot and Abraham do a lot of traveling together. Nahor is the father of Bethuel, who's the father of Laban. Laban is the one that Abraham sends, Bethuel he sends him to, and he's the father of Rebekah, whom Isaac marries. And then Isaac has Jacob, who goes to his uncle Laban, wanting Rachel, finds Leah, and the 2 servant girls, and finally gets to Rachel. And then from Jacob, we have of Leah, of Zilpah, of Bilhah, and Rachel, the 12 tribes, okay, as they develop. Now, Haran with Lot. Lot has 2 sons, Ammon and Moab. There's your Ammon and Moab of the Amos text. So, Esau, Edom, Ammon, and Moab become the ancestors of the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites. And so, hence, now that text of Amos that I read you, the Philistines, the Syrians, and the Phoenicians are not on this chart. Then we go to the Edomites, the Ammonites, and the Moabites are on this chart. They're relatives. And then there's the Israelites and the Judahites, or the Judah, whatever they are, and they're the ones who are at home. They're the group. And so Amos keeps pulling in, and finally he wants to say, Israel, you're just as bad as the rest of them. But again, knowing this chart, you can see that. Okay, so there's a family tree of the patriarchs. That kind of puts all those people in order for you. Would you please keep your patriarchs in order? Now, a little bit of history. So, this map wants to put Abraham back around 2100 BC. I'd actually move him down to about off the chart, but all the rest of the things fit together. Sarah and his wife. Then we have Sarah and Abraham. Then Isaac, born of Sarah. Isaac is sacrificed or is bound by Abraham at Genesis 15 on Mount Moriah. Isaac marries Rebekah. Then we have Ishmael, and Ishmael and Hagar cast out. Then the descendants of Ishmael in Genesis 25. And then Isaac's children, Jacob and Esau, and ultimately the 12 tribes. And here are the places that become, Shechem, Gerar, Mamre, Hebron. All these things are rather significant places. Mamre is where the patriarchs are buried. And Mamre is in Hebron. So in Hebron today, one of the sacred sites to both Judaism and Islam are the tombs of the patriarchs. So the tombs of the patriarchs are the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, etc. And what's interesting is they're all in cenotaphs, so they're empty. But you come in on one side, which is the Jewish side, and you see the tombs, or you come in on the other side, which is the Muslim side, and you see the tombs. Same tombs, but they're 2 different. So one side would be a synagogue, and the other side would be a mosque, but the same building. And it's also one of the most volatile areas of the West Bank today. Okay?
Now, Father, we're
Yes.
saying eventually we can print those off of...
I hope.
Hopefully.
I hope. Okay? I'm going to try. But for years now, this Moodle program and me have not gotten along.
Is that Hebron now, current day, what?
Hebron. It's current day Hebron. Yeah. You hear a lot about Hebron, in the news. Yeah, and it's due south and a little bit, I think, west of Bethlehem. Yeah. Okay.
Can Westerners go to those places?
Sure. I've been in both the mosque and the synagogue. Now, it's iffy getting in and out. Sometimes you can and sometimes you can't. I've been there when we've been able to get in. I've been there when we've not been able to get in. So it's at the whim of the people that are there.
Where to where the tombs are they mixed together then? The Palestinians and the...
Well, no. These are the tombs of the patriarchs, so they're accepted by both.
Okay.
See, so it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, etc. No, they're not. They're nowhere are they mixed.
Okay.
But these are the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, etc. But they can be seen from two different angles, is what it is.
So they're seen. They're not.
Yeah, they're not. Right.
Okay.
Exactly. As it develops, one side is a mosque and the other side is a synagogue. As it develops, but again, very, very significant. What's interesting is in the Quran, most of the Isaac stories of the Bible are Ishmael stories. But Abraham is very significant in both. Ishmael obviously would have a significance in the Quran, but also what Isaac would, and Jacob, etc. And then as long as I'm mentioning it, two other very prominent people in the Quran are Isa, which is Arabic for Jesus, and Maryam, which is Arabic for Mary. The virgin birth is in the Quran, which a lot of people don't realize. But there is no acceptance of Jesus as Son of God in the Quran.
So the virgin birth in the Quran was what?
A miraculous birth, because he's a miraculous person.
Oh.
A prophet secondary to Muhammad. Yeah. Okay, anyway, little bits and pieces of things. So Joseph then leads the Israelites, or brings the Israelites to Egypt around 1700, 400 years of bondage around 1690, and then the new Pharaoh is Sethi I, or possibly Ramesses II, but the Pharaoh of the Exodus is Ramesses II. And Moses and the Exodus basically will take place around 1290. That's a common year for that, to explain things. So then, there is debate, with regards to the date of the Exodus. More than likely around the first half of the 13th century BCE, so 1290 is a good date for that. The Hebrews labored at Avaris during the time of Sethi I, and Sethi I reigned from 1309 to 1290. Avaris is an area in that northern section of Egypt, at the extreme north end, by the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt, and we know that the Hebrew slaves labored there around the time of Sethi I. The Shtale of Merneptah demands that the conquest take place around 1220. So if 1290 we begin, and we have 40 years of wandering in the desert, that will bring us down to 1250. Then dividing up the land and everything else, 1220 as a date for the end of the conquest makes very good sense. But what we have, the problems that we have here is, because of the nature of the Exodus, whereby these Hebrew slaves escaped from Egypt, we're going to have no Egyptian records of it. Especially if you have an Egyptian army being drowned by these Hebrew slaves escaping, no Pharaoh in his right mind is going to keep records of that. So we have no Egyptian records, and the Israelites have records, but they don't necessarily have dates on them, the texts that we have in the Bible. And so we start going to outside sources, and one of the outside sources is this Shtale, or pillar, of Merneptah, which talks about things and places the date of the conquest around, completion of the conquest around 1220. So that would then put the latter half of the 13th century, 1290, and then 1250, and approximately 1240, 1230. Yeah, that puts it in a proper place, as far as things go. Now, the new Pharaoh basically enslaves the descendants of Joseph, and there's the decree to kill the male children. Moses is put in the basket and floated up the river, and he rises in Egypt until he discovers his ancestry. And then and how does he discover his ancestry? He kills a Hebrew, and basically then another Hebrew says to him, "Are you going to kill me like you did him?" And Moses suddenly comes to a realization that he's one of them. And then the call of God in Exodus 3 takes place. So let's look at the Exodus 3 text here and deal with a few things. Let me see how far we're getting here. Yeah, okay. So, when the Lord saw him coming to look at it more closely, the bush that burned but was not consumed, he called him out from the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he answered, "Here I am." And God said, "Come no nearer, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground." So Moses is on Mount Sinai. He sees this bush that's burned but not consumed. And Sinai is the mountain of the Lord, and so the place where you stand is holy ground. "I am the God of your father." That's a term that's been used for God. He continued, "The God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." Now, here's another place where the Old Testament comes in handy with the New Testament. Last Sunday's Gospel makes reference to this. Remember, he's talking about the God of the living. And he says he's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. There you are. See Exodus 3. So look at that and see if you catch some Old Testament references in the Gospels and things of that sort. Because they're there. Moses hid his face and was afraid to look at God. Of course, you can't look at God and see and live. But the Lord said, "I have witnessed the affliction of my people in Egypt and have heard their cry of complaint against their slave drivers, so I know well what they are suffering. Therefore I have come down to rescue them from the hands of the Egyptians and lead them out of that land into a good land and a spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the country of the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites." In other words, the land that Abraham had. There's those ites again. "So indeed the cry of the Israelites reached me, and I have truly noted that the Egyptians are oppressing them. Come now, I will send you to Pharaoh and lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I, that I should go to Pharaoh and lead the Israelites out of Egypt?" He answered, "I will be with you, and this shall be your proof that it is I who have sent you. When you bring my people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this very mountain." Hence, when they leave Egypt, they're supposed to go to Sinai. Now, you'd think that Moses would know the way to Sinai since he's already been there, but it's taken him a little time to get there. But said Moses to God, "When I go to the Israelites and I say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' if they ask me, 'What is his name?' what am I to tell them?" This is a very significant text now, because it's the revelation of God's name. And with the revelation of the name, notice, a change of name, we said with Abraham, is a change of job, a change of status in life, etc. The revelation of the name is an ability to call upon, and in a certain sense, an ability to have power over. When you know someone's name, I think all of you, principals, teachers, etc., have had the experience that if a student figures you don't know their name and suddenly you call them by name, it's, "Wait a minute!" and you have a power for a second or two as far as things go. But that's that whole thing of the name. Name, I don't know if you've noticed when I've been translating names for you, but they have something to do with what the person does or did. Name in the Old Testament equals person. Okay? And so now God is giving you his name. And so what is his name? I am who am. Ahyeh asher ahyeh. What? Then he added, This is what you shall tell the Israelites. I am sent me to you. Now, the divine name is Yod He Vav Cheth. It's 4 letters. And so it's called the Tetragrammaton. Tetra in Greek is 4, gramma is letter. So technically it's the 4-letter word, but not in the bad sense. But it's a 4-letter word that's unpronounceable. And for that, because of that, because later on when we get to the commandments, the second commandment is going to say, you shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. What Jewish people will say is to make sure you don't use it in vain, you shan't use it at all. And so we will make the name of God unpronounceable. Now we put vowels into it and say Yahweh. Others will put vowels into it and say Jehovah. Remember, Y-H-W-H, J-H-W-H. Yahweh, Jehovah, same thing. But what the good Jewish person does is when they see the Tetragrammaton, the name of God, they will say Adonai, which means my Lord. So Yahweh is never said by a good Jew. It's always Adonai, my Lord. And so in some translations, to distinguish Yahweh, Adonai, my Lord God, from Elohim, Lord, it'll say Lord God for Yahweh and Elohim for Lord. But in actuality, the Yahweh or the Ahyeh Asher Ahyeh is I am who am. I am the one who is, i.e. the one who is eternally. Notice again, a characteristic of God. Or I am the one who causes to be, the origin of all things. Those are some of the translations that are given of Yahweh, but actually it is not a form. The verb is Haya, which means to be, but the form Yahweh is not a form of Haya, as Yitzhak is of Sa'ak, or Yaakov is of Akov, or something of that sort. Yahweh is not a form. And so it's got an impossibility about it on all fronts, basically. But the idea is, Thomas Aquinas says, Yahweh is he whose being is his essence is his existence. You know, ens entis. SA equals ens, if you want to use the Thomistic terminology. But all of that stuff comes out of this text of Exodus 3. Okay? So there's the revelation of, but again, when you get into the New Testament, you know, there's overtones of this I am all over the place. In John's Gospel, in the garden scene, the soldiers come, and Jesus says, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And he says, I am he. Ego eimi, which is the translation of I am. What do the soldiers do? They fall on their faces. An appropriate response in front of God. But, you know, it's an overtone. So when you hear I am in the New Testament, there's that overtone of the divine name that's hidden from here. Okay? All sorts of things. You know, the two fit together nicely. Okay, let's move forward then. End of sidelight. So now, the Exodus, as I said before, we have no extra biblical evidence of these events because Egyptian evidence wouldn't hold to it. Nevertheless, the event of the Exodus and the events of Sinai are key in the formation of Israel. Early creeds, Deuteronomy 6:20-25, Deuteronomy 26:5-10, talk about this. Looking at Deuteronomy 26, which gets misread every now and then. Then you shall declare before the Lord your God, my father was a wandering Aramean. Please remember that when you read it. I've heard it any number of times. My father was a wandering Armenian. My father was a wandering Aramean who went down to Egypt with a small household and lived there as an alien. Notice, back to Exodus. But then he came to be a great nation, strong and numerous, and when the Egyptians maltreated and oppressed us, imposing hard labor upon us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our fathers. He heard our cry, saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. He brought us out of Egypt with his strong hand and outstretched arm, with terrifying power, with signs and wonders. And bringing us into this country, he gave us this land. There's the land again. Notice what's missing. He brought us out of Egypt with strong arm. He brought us into this country and gave us this land. No Sinai. No Sinai in that creed. Sinai comes from a different place, overall. But all of the Exodus stuff, all of the stuff we're talking about here in Exodus, and it becomes very important in these early creeds of Israel. The Israelites were penned in by the Egyptians and the sea. So basically they're led to the sea, and then they start grumbling at Moses. Oh, that's the great thing they do, is grumble all over the place at Moses. And what does Moses do? He parts the sea of reeds. So the wind blows the water back, they pass, and the wind shifts, the waters recede, and the Egyptians are caught. Okay, so you have the wonderful scene in the Ten Commandments of Moses, with his staff and the waters and whatnot, and all the Israelites going through, and then the waters coming back on the Egyptians. Watch the Ten Commandments and see what's going on here. Okay. So, but no, would you record such an incident in Egyptian sources? Now, the location, as I pointed out, is uncertain. The sea is not the Red Sea, obviously. I showed you that on the map. Rather, it's the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, which is a body of water east of Avaris, an arm of the Lake Menzela. The site is not central to the faith. The fact of the Exodus is that what sea they went through is not central. It's the fact that they went through something that's central. Okay, now here's a blown-up map. Here's Ramesses, which is one of the towns, and here's Pithom, which is the other town. The area of Goshen is where the Israelites lived, and so basically the place where they crossed into Sinai is more than likely around here somewhere, and then came down one side and up the other, or across, if you will. But I think basically across is desert. Down here you have water. And up here you have water. And so basically, as I said, this is the Gulf of Aqaba, this is the Gulf of Suez. And here you have, I believe, somewhere along here you have the Suez Canal, which basically connects the Gulf of Suez. I think it's kind of getting the Gulf of Suez to the Mediterranean overall. So Sinai itself is by many people thought to be down here, by others thought to be up here. And then they came across through Moab and up to across here, and at Jericho crossed into the Promised Land. Now, notice, here's the area of Ammon. Here's the area of Moab. And here's the area of Edom. So the three relatives, and it's the immediate east. Ammon, I think today, the capital of Jordan, is connected up with this. It's one of the remains. Actually, the capital is Amman, but I think there is a connection here because this is Jordan in an area. Moab has disappeared and Edom has disappeared. But later on in Jesus' day, this will be Idumea down here, the land of Herod the Great. And so then you have a lot of desert area further down, and of course Sinai itself is almost a whole desert area. So there's not much stuff that's there. Your green is in this area, and of course your real fertile green is in the delta of the Nile River over here. So that's where things are happening. Okay, so locations then are not really that definable. They journey then to Mount Sinai. And as I pointed out, the location is disputed. Tradition has it at the southern tip of Sinai, Jebel Musa, but others say it's the eastern section near the Gulf of Aqaba, and others say it's in the northern section. So those three areas that I pointed out to you there. The oasis at Kadesh, many people fleeing Egypt joined them together there, and there's another whole series of stories and numbers that take place at Kadesh. Now, what happens at Sinai? Why is Sinai so important? Sinai becomes important because Moses receives the law. Paul will talk about 3 stages of human history. From Abraham to Moses, or from Adam to Moses, really, where there was a period of no law. Moses to the Messiah, which was a period of law, and then the period of the Messiah. Now, Paul can make this distinction because of his experience of Jesus. Prior to Paul's experience of Jesus, there was the time of no law and the time of law. In the experience of Jesus, we are freed from the law. And so Paul will take many of the themes of the freedom from the bondage of Egypt and apply them to a freedom from the bondage of law in his writings. And so all this Exodus stuff becomes very important in Paul overall. So notice, Hagar, Sarah becomes important in Paul. Exodus becomes important in Paul. You got to know your Old Testament to read Paul, as far as things go, as it develops. So there's a number of things that are happening here. Okay. The other thing that happened at Sinai is Israel became a people. Sinai is a key constitutive event. But I said not everybody was at Sinai, and that's correct. The people at Sinai became a people. But it's with this final renewal of Sinai, once the land is divided at the end of Joshua, that everybody comes into what happened to participate in what happened at Sinai. So they are not officially a nation until the end of Exodus, or the end of Joshua, but here there is a constitutive event. Now, as you read both, you'll see this developing rather significantly, but the way the Bible portrays it is everybody seems to have gone to Egypt, everybody seems to have come out of Egypt, everybody seems to have gone to Sinai, everybody seems to have wandered in the desert, and everybody seems to have ended up back in the land again. The reality of the fact is everybody probably didn't do everything. Some did one, some did another, and ultimately with that covenant renewal with Joshua, everybody participates then in the covenant and they become a nation. That's the way it works. Okay? But the Bible would lead you to think everybody does. And a religion comes about, the religion of Yahweh, the religion of Yahwism. And the early creeds are designed for a recitation at the feast of this renewal covenant, that creed that I read to you from Deuteronomy. The Sinai and Exodus traditions then are separate and then ultimately joined. John Bright seems to think that they were originally joined together. Gerhard von Rad seems to think that they were not. And again, I would tend to think that they probably were not, because that text I read to you from Deuteronomy has Exodus traditions, but it has no Sinai. So there seems to have been a division at that point. But it's a point of dispute. And just realize it's a point of dispute. You don't have to get into all the different minutiae of what's happening, but you would realize that there is no Sinai in that Deuteronomy text, and that Deuteronomy text is read as a Sunday reading. So somebody may ask about that, so you need to know a little bit about it anyway. Okay. So Yahweh technically was a god who seemed to have been worshipped by the Midianites or the Kenites of the Sinai Peninsula. So the religion of Yahweh was existing before Moses' day. Moses was set up with Midianites. Moses learned about it from his father-in-law Jethro. Jethro was one of the ones who lived on the Sinai Peninsula. You recall that Moses comes and he meets his wife on the Sinai Peninsula. He draws water for these women. They invite him back to the house. And eventually Zipporah is his wife, and Jethro is the father of Zipporah. In one source, in another source, his name is Hobab. Hobab and Jethro are the same person. Jethro presides at a sacrifice in the presence of Yahweh at Exodus 18, as it develops. Okay, now the covenant. Here's where the things are significant. As I say, Sinai is a key event in the history of Israel. God enters into covenant with the people, and it's a bilateral covenant. So God has responsibilities and the people have responsibilities. I will be your God if you will be my people. What does be my people mean? Follow the stipulations that I will make to you. Okay. Patterned on the Hittite suzerainty pacts. Now, Boat does a big thing about this, and I'm going to go through it rather technically here. But the way the Hittite pacts were laid up, there's 6 parts. And we can find the same 6 parts in the Sinai covenant. And so, what is a Hittite suzerainty pact? There's a preamble. Suzerain basically means a sovereign, okay? But there's a preamble where one of the parties identifies themselves, the more powerful party in a certain sense. There's a historical prologue. What led to us coming to this treaty? What's going on that we're making this treaty or this pact? Then there's stipulations. What are the requirements? What is each one going to do? Then a provision for the display of the text of the treaty. This will be displayed in the court of so-and-so and such and whatever. That one we're not going to necessarily see that strongly in the biblical point. Then a list of witnesses, the gods before whom the treaty is sworn, who I swear before, and the list of gods listed. And then a list of blessings for following things and a list of curses for not. Consequences, blessings for following and consequences for not following the treaty. So a preamble, prologue, stipulations, display, witnesses, and blessings and curses. Okay. Now, Exodus 20. This is a very, very significant text, as it develops. It's the 10 Commandments as we know them. But you're going to see something rather interesting. Then God delivered all these commandments, the translation says. The Hebrew is devarim. A commandment in Hebrew is a mitzvah. Interesting. You've heard that term before, haven't you? Yeah, there's a bar by that name. Mitzvah is a command. A covenant one. And so God delivered to Moses all these devarim, words. The Hebrew there is words. It's not commandment, which I find rather interesting. Now, what is the first commandment? Don't look at the book. What is the first commandment?
I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other God before me.
I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other or no strange gods before me. Correct. All right. Look at what Exodus says. I am the Lord your God. Identification of the suzerain. Who brought you out of Egypt, the house of slavery. There's your historical prologue. You shall not have other gods before me. The stipulations. Very, very important line. See, when you look at the 10 Commandments, the commandments as we learned them, I am the Lord your God, you shall not have strange gods before me. You nasty people, you will not. But here, it's, I'm the Lord your God. Here's what I've done for you. And in response to what I've done for you, this is what I'm asking you to do for me. A totally different way of looking at it. See, so when you put the parts of the suzerain treaty in, it makes very good sense. But this line is never quoted. And I think it's very, very important. Because when God asks people to do things legally for law, God has done something for the people that law becomes a response. It's not a blatant, command. It's a response. And again, that I saw that, and that just completely threw me all over the place. Gave me a whole new view of how to look at legal texts in the Old Testament. But there's the first commandment. Now, one other thing. There are other gods around. See, again, we look at this commandment in a monotheistic world. God's the only God. And that's absolutely right. We are in a monotheistic world. As a result of Deutero-Isaiah, we're in a monotheistic world. Moses and the Exodus and the Ten Commandments were not. There were other gods. And so Israel's religion is a religion of one God. I am the Lord. But one God around whom there are others. And so, yes, there are other gods about, but I am your God, and you will be my people. So this is not monotheism. What is it? It's henotheism. One God. Okay? Hen in Greek means one. So, and again, the henotheism of Exodus becomes the monotheism of 2nd Isaiah as a result of the experience of the exile. So in a couple of weeks we'll talk about how this changes. But there are other gods. Now, I ask a question, but I'm going to give you the answer. You're nice people. No, the question that I ask is, which of the Ten Commandments is the most difficult to keep? And of course I get answers around the 5th, the 6th, the 4th. The answer is the first. Because how often do we put other things before God? And that's the first commandment. See how all this stuff does apply to your life? You know, you got all sorts of things to go home and think about tonight. But, you know, there's the first commandment. Is God primary and first in my life? That's the first commandment. And what are the gods in my life? There's another meditation on the first commandment. You know, you shall not have other gods before me. That could keep you going for months, you know, overall. But again, and I think these are things you can even use with the children in your schools and things of that sort as to what this is all about. You know, is your football game more important than church on Sunday? Is, you know, yeah. There's the commandment. Okay, there's practical application. I'm into that too. Okay. Note, as I said, the use of other. Acharim. Elohim acharim hal panei, before my face. Achar in Hebrew means another or other. And so basically the existence of other gods is accepted in Exodus, as I pointed out. So this is technically henotheism, the belief in one God in a culture where there are many.
What was the role of those other gods in their culture?
Well, they were gods of other people.
Of other people.
Yeah.
But I mean,
Now from here on, Israel's God is Yahweh. But the big problem Israel's going to have is they're going to have to interact with these other people, and these other people, particularly the Canaanites, are going to say, "Oh, you want good crops? You got to sacrifice to Baal, because he gives us rain to give us good crops." Well, of course, they use the modern farming methods and they violate the first commandment, and Deuteronomically they violate the first commandment and God punishes. And so, boom, it gets to be a vicious cycle. But, you know, and I think you're hitting upon a good point, because, yes, Yahweh's their God, and they're to follow him or her, but basically there are other gods in the midst who are very prominent among other people that they have to deal with. And how do you deal with this? How do we, as Catholics, in a world that many other things are seen to be God, deal with God? We have the same problem. We have the same problem. Okay. You shall not make a graven image, nor bow down and serve them. Okay. Wait a minute. That's not the second commandment. It isn't. That commandment doesn't get into our lists. And it's a problem. Basically, the Ten Commandments, this is the second, but what's the third is going to be the second. And then the last two are going to get united into one. And so we end up with 10. But, you know, graven image. This is where there can be no images of God in Judaism, where there's no images of God in Islam, etc. We get people, and again, many of the Protestant churches will say there should be no images, and so they get upset with our statues. The East, there was a whole iconoclastic controversy in about the 6th or 7th century where they started breaking images, iconoclasm. And so the whole thing of statues, the whole thing of icons, the whole thing of representations, all they say should not be. And of course, what people will say was, you drop that commandment out, and that's there, and you shouldn't have all these statues. But the question is, does the statue get the worship that belongs to the person, or does the statue remind us of the person whom we venerate? And the answer to the iconoclast controversy is the distinction of veneration versus adoration. Adoration goes to God, veneration goes to statues, etc., and saints and so on. But notice, but again, similarly, Moses is up on Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, and he stays up there a little too long. And what happens, the people don't like the fact that Moses is hanging around the mountain a little longer than they thought. Did he die? What's happened to him? Let's get our own God. And so they get his brother Aaron to come down and take all the gold that they brought out of Egypt, and they make a graven image of a golden calf. And Moses comes down the mountain with the tablets of the law, and what does he see? Orgiastic ritual in front of this graven image, the golden calf, and he throws the tablets at the calf, and it gets demolished. While Moses is receiving the law, the people are violating it. Now, one other thing, future. When the kingdom splits, Jeroboam, the king of the northern kingdom, doesn't want people going to Jerusalem, so he sets up his own temples. And what does he do in those temples? He sets up a golden calf. Uh-oh, there's trouble. Golden calves appear throughout history of Israel too. And of course, that's known as the sin of Jeroboam. Oh. The golden calf in the plastic bottle.
Appropriate time.
You shall not use the name of the Lord your God in vain. There's our second commandment. Now, of course, we interpret that as no swearing, no this, no that, which is true. But the actuality of it is you should not use the name other than to call upon God in prayer. Well, okay, maybe there'll be misuses and so on. How do we get around it? We don't use it at all. And so Jewish people basically don't use the name at all. They don't say the name. And that's where the thing about Adonai and Yahweh and everything else comes in. If you don't say the name, you can't use it in vain. You shall keep holy the Lord's day. It's the command to, and of course, it's a command to rest. It's not primarily a command, and I'm not saying you don't have to, please don't get me wrong here, but it's not primarily a command to go to Mass on Sunday, it's a command to rest. Because God rested on the seventh day. See, and of course it's to emphasize what's going to become the third commandment, or what is the third commandment, that the priestly writer makes the big thing about the Sabbath and the Sabbath rest in the first account of Genesis. Honor your father and your mother. Now, of course, with your young people, you'll say that means obey your parents, and it does, but that's not its primary meaning. The primary meaning of the fourth commandment, or the fifth commandment, is to take care of your elderly parents. Be around to care for people in their old age, because there was no place for them to go. Particularly a mother whose husband has passed away, children have the obligation to care for a widow. Okay? We had the parable of the widow and the judge a few weeks ago, where a widow wasn't getting what she needed. And without getting what she needed, she has no recourse but to go to the legal system and badger the legal system to get what she needs, otherwise she doesn't have anything. Fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother, particularly your mother if her husband has passed away. That's the primary meaning. The secondary meaning is children who are young obeying their parents. Thou shalt not kill to preserve the sanctity of life. And of course, there's all sorts of discussion going on about the preservation of the sanctity of life. But it's the sanctity of life from the moment of conception to the moment of death. And so there's all sorts of things that are connected up in there. Some people would say, yes, but it really is translated, thou shalt not murder. Well, kill, murder, same difference. Whether you kill a person or you murder a person, it's bad for the person. So... Sort of the line from Man of La Mancha, whether the rock hits the pitcher or the pitcher hits the rock, it's going to be bad for the pitcher. Thou shalt not commit adultery to preserve the sanctity of marriage, to preserve the sanctity of family life, etc. Thou shalt not steal, the sanctity of property, that property belongs to individuals. Thou shalt not bear false witness, to preserve the sanctity of reputation. That, a person is entitled to their reputation and you do not bear false witness against them. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife, and thou shalt not covet your neighbor's goods. Now, covet basically is desire. So, 6 has to do with action, 9 has to do with desire, 7 has to do with action, 9 has to do with desire. So, 6 and 7 say don't commit adultery and don't steal. 9 and 10 say don't even think about it. Don't even think about it, as far as things go. And when you put the graven images in as 2, you join 9 and 10 together to get 10. Okay, so those would be various different ways you'd look at the 10 Commandments. So in summary then, the Mosaic covenant differs from the patriarchal covenant. The patriarchal is unconditional for future, the land, and you will be a descendant, have descendants, etc. The believer only has to trust, and it's unilateral. So Abraham just has to trust in God that in the future there will be a great nation. The Exodus covenant is based on gracious acts already performed. I brought you out of the land of Egypt. There's an obligation, and it's bilateral. And so this one's going to be similar to the Davidic covenant we're going to see. This one's going to remain and reappear in Deuteronomy as time goes on. And the tension between the unilateral and the bilateral will be very, very evident later on in the monarchy. Okay? So, any questions on the Mosaic covenant or any observations on the Mosaic covenant before we start wandering in the desert? I hope you brought your water. No? Yes?
What is the significance of the golden calf? Does that have any... you said it appears many times. Graven image, and of course the bull and the calf were fertility symbols for the day, and things of that sort. But I think it's primarily the graven image, and then the fact that it was a calf. The point I was making is we have Aaron fashioning a golden calf, which was seen as being a violation of the covenant. But then Jeroboam goes and does the same thing, knowing that that's what was what, and then sort of like it's seen as leading people astray from the religion of God, thinking he's going to live with the religion of God. But basically it's going to be known in Deuteronomistic terms as the sin of Jeroboam. And actually it's going to remain until Josiah, whom we mentioned a brief bit, will come along and tear down the 2 gold altars to the golden calves, and he will be raised up as a great king because he did that. No? Then you got to listen to me more. Okay, let's go wandering. So after Sinai then, the focal point becomes Kadesh, which is an oasis toward the north end of the Sinai Peninsula, almost on the border of the Promised Land in that area. So more wandering leads to the conquest of the Amorite king Heshbon. They have fights with people, and the eastern detour accords with time. Edom and Moab were secured by line of fortresses, etc. Now, why is this 40 years of desert wandering? What's going on there? It's basically seen as a punishment for the golden calf incident.
Because they had violated the covenant before they even knew about the covenant, they were forced to wander. And literally, if you follow the route through Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they're going around in circles. They're literally going around in circles. Somebody should have given Moses a GPS. But anyway, and there is some things that take place at Kadesh Barnea and other situations. But another text that becomes rather significant in this is the text of Moses at Massa and Meribah, where Moses is to get water for the people. So the people are, saying, Moses, you brought us out here to this god-awful place. We had it better in Egypt. They're constantly grumbling. And Moses is sort of saying, God, what did you give me these people for? Why didn't you leave them in Egypt? But anyway, God says to Moses, tap the rock and water will come forth. And Moses taps the rock and no water comes. And so, just like me with the computer this morning, I pressed PowerPoint and no PowerPoint comes. So what do? I press PowerPoint again. And the computer refuses to do anything and punishes me by making me start all over. Well, that would be nice if God did that, but Moses tapped the rock a second time, and God says, sorry, you violated me, you're not getting into the promised land. And so Moses, as a result of his tapping the rock twice, not having faith in God that he would give them the water, is prohibited from entering into the promised land. So he gets as far as Mount Nebo in the book of Deuteronomy. He sees the land, but he dies. And so he's brought in a box, basically, and buried. So, again, this is the Old Testament God. You got to be, I will be your God if you will be my people. You got to do things the way we want to do them here, as far as things go. Okay. So that's basically the end of the Pentateuch, where Moses has passed away and power then passes to his primary compatriot Joshua, and Joshua now leads the people into the promised land, basically. And so the conquest then is a very, very interesting situation, because it's generally thought that Joshua has 3 military campaigns. So they come in from Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Now, the problem here is, if we're going to do the dating system that we're doing, there weren't any Jericho in Jericho when Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and there weren't any walls to come tumbling down. The main city at that time was Ai. Now, Joshua fit the battle of Ai doesn't work too well. So we don't know, in terms of that, what's going on, but Jericho is seen as being the great spot, and so there was an entry from here and a central takeover. Then some went south and conquered that way, others went north and conquered that way. And so basically to retake the land. And so it's 3 military campaigns that are described in the book of Joshua. Now, biblical tradition, the main account is in Joshua 1-12. And it basically implies that they enter, they quickly act, they take the land, and it's all over. There's three campaigns, the central, the south, and the north. And then the land is divided up among the 12 tribes. Each of the groups gets their particular area of land. Another tradition that we find in the book of Judges, however, seems to imply that it was more of an infiltration and a process where they kind of went their way and they kind of melded in with the groups and the people that were there, and it was a much longer process. And that's part of the Deuteronomistic history in terms of things. Martin Noth, John Bright, Gerhard von Rad, all of them are having their own theories with regards to this, but either it was quick, fast, and boom, as Joshua says it, or it was slow infiltration, as Judges says it. Or it may have been a form of both. But, we don't have anything to tell us one way or the other. Both will go into that whole thing, too, as to what's happening. And then Judges has a unified invasion in terms of things. Now, the narratives here are separate traditions, and they want to explain, many of the narratives we find in Joshua and Judges want to explain the origin of place names. Where did we get these places? So they're etiological. as we said before. And a lot of them are joined around the figure of Joshua, who's of the tribe of Ephraim, a tribal hero, and he leads the tribes united together. And most likely, some would say, that the conquest was a peaceful kind of infiltration. That works along with the history of things and whatever. How do they get in? How do they deal with things? But it's a matter, though, of reconquering the land, because they've been gone for 400 plus years. And the land isn't going to sit there for 400 plus years. Somebody's going to take it over. And now all of a sudden, armed with their promise of Abraham, this is our land. We're going to take it. God gave it to us. Sorry, folks. And then, go from there. That's going to happen a few more times. So, in the 13th century, after 1250, we have recollections and we have archaeological evidence that many of the towns in the area were destroyed. Devir, Kiryat Sefor, Lachish, Eglon, Hatzor. Hatzor is probably the most significant because we have, Hatzor and Megiddo, we have levels. And we can see when destructions took place. And Hatzor was also a very, very prominent town where the king of Hatzor lived. And so, if you have a destruction of Hatzor and Lachish, which is also significant, in or around 1250, 1250 would be about the time, if we're going to look at this, if 1290 was the Exodus, 1250 would be 40 years later, so at the end of the 40 years wandering, we'd have 1250. Suddenly, in the area around 1250, we have a significant number of towns in the land being destroyed. There's a conquest for you. So that puts it in proper perspective. That's the argumentation for that. And let me see, where am I at here? There we are, yeah, okay. So then there's a violent eruption into the land that took place in the later 13th century. But as I said before, Jericho was not a great fortress as depicted in Joshua, but a small little town that fell in the 13th century. And the town of Ai was destroyed in the late 3rd millennium. So, two theories: quick, slow. That's basically what you need to know. And Boat will fill in a few more pieces in that regard. Okay. Now, again, the conquest according to Joshua, we have, various different towns coming in and being destroyed. Here's the campaigns of the Israelites in red, and the counter campaigns of the Canaanites in blue. And the Canaanites are the ones who basically are, living in the land at the time. Now, once the land is conquered, and once the land has been divided, there is a grand gathering at Gerizim on Mounts Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. The town of, what is it? Not Samaria. Shechem. That's it. The town of Shechem is at the feet of Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. So you almost, in Joshua 24, you have this picture of the people of Israel up the sides of the two mountains, gathered. And now this is everybody who has come into the land, was in the land, is joined with the tribes, etc. So this is the first time you got everybody together. And once you have everybody together, what do? They recommit themselves to the covenant at Sinai. This is where the Sinai covenant becomes accepted by all. And it's seen as a covenant renewal. It's in Joshua 24. So a very, very significant text in the book of Joshua. So Joshua said to the people, "You cannot serve the Lord, for He is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods," there are those other gods, "then He will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good." Notice, Very Deuteronomic. If you go after other gods, he will go after you, after he's done good for you. And the people said to Joshua, "Nay, we will serve the Lord." Then Joshua said to the people, excuse me for reading it to you, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." And then he said, "Then put away the foreign gods which are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel." And the people said to Joshua, "The Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. We will be his people, if he will be our God." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made statutes and ordinances for them at Shechem. So there is the completion of the entire process. There is the foundation of the nation of Israel, religiously and politically. And so Israel is founded here in Shechem at the foot of Mounts Gerizim and Ebal. Okay, so summary then. At this point, Abraham's promises have been fulfilled. Abraham's descendants are a great nation. He is considered the father of a great nation, and his descendants are as numerous as the stars in the sky. He has descendants from both Isaac and Ishmael. They possess the land, and they're a great nation. So the promises that were made to Abraham at 10 o'clock this morning are now fulfilled at 1 in the afternoon. God acts quickly. Okay. Any questions about any of that now that come in? We might actually make it. Yes?
What was the approximate time period for the covenant renewal, like date-wise?
Approximately 1230, 1220, in or around there. And then from that point to around 1000, we have this period that's called the Amphictyony or the Confederacy. Here's where I parallel the history of Israel to the history of the United States, except that their confederacy lasted longer than ours. When the Revolutionary War was fought, the 13 colonies basically had hegemony. They were kind of united together under a presidency, but they had great significant power. They were, the Articles of Confederation basically are what held them together. But there wasn't really too much of a centralized governmental situation. They came to the realization that they needed a much more centralized governmental situation, and so that's when the Constitution was written, and then the presidency was formed, and the United States came into existence as a nation. That was approximately 20 years. Israel was a little different. Israel basically had its 12 tribes, and Dan wouldn't exert power over Issachar, and Issachar wouldn't exert power over Zebulun. Everybody lived their own happy little way, except there were all these Phoenicians and Philistines and Ammonites and various other ites around them, and they would come in and start battling. And if they fought against Dan, Issachar wouldn't come to help, because that's Dan's problem. If they fought against Manasseh, Ephraim wouldn't come to help, because that's Manasseh's problem. And then basically what Manasseh would have to do, or what Dan would have to do, was holler to say, "Help! I'm not going to exist if you don't do this." And then they'd come together. And they'd throw out the oppressor, and life would continue on. And that went on for about 200 years, whereby, they lived that way, and suddenly, or through the process of the 200 years, they came to realize we need a central government. We need to be like every other nation. Every other nation has a king. We need a king. And toward the end of the Confederacy or the Amphictyony, there was this movement to start a monarchy or a king. And of course, the staunch people said, we can't have a king because Yahweh's our king, and we can't have somebody in his place. Others say we need a king. There's no way getting around it. To be like other nations that survive around here, we need a king. Well, ultimately, the pro-monarchical group won out and they had a king. That's next week's class. But with that in mind, let's look at now this Confederate period and see what's developing here, this tribal confederacy. So here are your tribes. Okay, Naphtali toward the north, Asher, Manasseh, Gad, Zebulun, Issachar. Manasseh has a tremendous amount of area. Ephraim, Benjamin, Reuben, Judah, etc. Judah's pretty big too. Now, when it's going to split, by the way, it's Benjamin and Judah that are going to become the south, and everybody else becomes the north. And here we have basically the Ammonites out here, the Moabites down here, that's Simeon's area there, the Philistines up here, and so, there's a number of things that are developing. Okay, now this Amphictyony is basically a loose confederation of tribes. This is a term John Bright coined, and it's a nice sounding term. It's a $10,000 word. If you ever hear about the Amphictyony, that's what it's about. But it's a confederation that is a religious confederation. So it's a confederation around a central sanctuary. Well, what's been happening? From the time of Moses on, the Sinai covenant basically, as far as its, it has its laws, etc., but it also established the Ark of the Covenant. It established a tent of meeting. It established, that the Ark would lead the Israelite people by cloud during the day and fire by night. And so there was a religious center of Yahwism there. That center then came to Shechem. It came to Kiryat Jearim and various other places. So the Amphictyony is a loose confederation politically around a central sanctuary religiously. Gilgal is another place where the sanctuary... So the sanctuary sort of moved in some senses. But, it was one sanctuary, and that's where they dealt with. And ultimately, once the monarchy is established, then David sets up Jerusalem as his political capital and then moves the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and makes it the religious capital also. But up to that point, the central sanctuary, so sacred traditions then, and sacred institutions, the priesthood, the Levites, develop and achieve normative form. Israel's faith, however, is not an outgrowth of the Amphictyony, rather it constituted the Amphictyony. And so their belief in Yahweh, etc., constitutes this. Now, what about this religion of Israel? It's based on the fact that relationship exists between God and His people. That relationship we call covenant. I will be your God if you will be my people. Yahweh has chosen Israel as the object of favor. Again, if you look at Exodus, when we introduce this, there's a language there that's rather interesting. In Exodus 19, I think this is it. Now, where is that text? Yeah, there it is, I think. Yeah. When Israel was encamped here in the front of the mountain, Moses went up to the mountain of God. Then the Lord called him and said, "Thus shall you say to the house of Jacob, tell the Israelites, you have seen for yourself how I treated the Egyptians and how I bore you up on eagle wings and brought you here to myself." Notice there's a reference to the Exodus in the Sinai text. "Therefore, if you hearken to my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my special possession, dearer to me than all other people, though all the earth is mine." There's the relationship between God and Israel. "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation." This is what you must tell the Israelites. Special possessions, segula. There's a farm which God owns, if you will, which a farmer owns. And then there's the farmhouse where the farmer lives. All the earth is the farm that God owns. Israel is the farmhouse where God lives. There's the relationship. There's the relationship as it develops. So Yahweh has chosen Israel as the object of His favor, and Israel has committed herself to Him as His people at Sinai and in Joshua 24. So I will be your God and you will be my people. That's the refrain of this class. So now after the conquest, then Israel organized itself into a confederation of 12 clans, the 12 tribes. But there was no central government, as I pointed out. A sacred league of 12 clans bound in sacred alliance to Yahweh. Okay? Not based on kinship, despite the relationship of the 12 sons of Jacob. So what unites the kingdom, what unites Israel, is not its kinship, but its faith. Now, the tribal league, kinship in the Bible is used to express a feeling of solidarity that may derive from other sources. So basically it's tied up. No possibility of blood origin. Israel is really a diverse amalgam of peoples. The story tells us that they all seem to be related. But in essence, these people were probably not all related to each other. You know, they're not descendants of this one and that one. When it came together, it ended up being relationships and so on. Again, you know, when in your own families, when a non-relative is around the family, is involved with the family, does everything with the family, how do you tell your children to refer to this John, Michael? Uncle John. And, then, well, how is Uncle John Uncle John? Well, then all of a sudden something comes up and there may be a story of this and that, and, that's what's going on here. That's what's going on here. That these people have all came together. We've had this common experience. We've been molded into this common people, and we have a common history. And so now let's go back and look at that history. But does it necessarily mean that everybody's related to everybody else? No. And that's what's going on here. It's not possible to form a single family tree. Again, if you look at Israel today, the same thing happens. Israel's religious tradition, it's a common faith, not a common bloodline that separates and keeps them moving and keeps them going. Okay, so Israel came into existence in Palestine as a loose confederation around the religion of Yahwism. The central sanctuary, the 12 tribes. 12 months of the year, each month, one tribe works the sanctuary, hence 12 tribes. That's why we get 12, each tribe basically has 2 courses of priests, course for a 2-year cycle. Recall Zechariah in Luke, it happens to be the time for his course of priesthood to be at the temple serving. There it is, that's going on. Each takes a turn at the sanctuary. The focal point is the Ark of the Covenant, which is in the sanctuary, and the main sanctuary becomes Shiloh, and each tribe is represented by his leader, who is a Nasi or a prince. So each tribe is set up. So what is the purpose of the tribes? The purpose of the tribes is to provide people to serve at the sanctuary. But the Levites are the priests who live at the sanctuary also. Now, the central shrine is the house the ark, the tabernacle, and the tent of meeting. The tabernacle is the place where God dwells, where the Shekinah is, and the tent of meeting is where the people gather, if you will. So far, everything is portable, because there's still a people on the move. You can pick up and move. And so it's a tent. It's not a building, And even though they're settling down and they're becoming agricultural and they're farming and doing other things, there's still a necessity to be able to move around. It's only with David that we build a temple and we place things permanently in line. With the monarchy, things become permanent. So the central shrine is a place called Shiloh. And one time, however, it was in the area of Gilgal. Shiloh is, by the time of David, and later on, Shiloh is destroyed, as far as things go. Now, what are the institutions? we have a clergy. We have a cult. So we have a liturgy around the central sanctuary. Presiding there was a chief priest, and the priesthood was hereditary. So, some of the chief priests that are around, Abiathar, a name that becomes rather significant in the books of Samuel, is the chief priest at Nav. Abiathar's father is Ahimelech, again a chief priest. Abiathar and Ahimelech are mentioned in the New Testament, oddly enough, as far as things go. But they are from the tribe of Levi. Okay, so they come from the priestly or the Levitical tribe, but non-Levites do minister before the ark. For instance, Samuel, it was not an Ephraimite, Samuel's an Ephraimite, and the priests of Shiloh descend from Aaron. The Levite is pledged by a vow. It's not necessarily ancestral either. And so, the whole notion of the outlying priests will eventually there'll be the sanctuary, and then there's outlying priests. And we're going to have a whole thing with the priesthood next week when the temple comes in, and we have a priesthood that is connected up not with Aaron, but with Zadok. And the outlying priests that connect up with Aaron and Levi. So that the Levites end up, when the temple comes along, in second place. Whereas in here, they're in first place, offering things. Okay, sacrifice. So some connection. There was an interference, or there was an influence of Canaanite gods and Canaanite sacrificial practice with the sacrificial practice of Yahweh. And so there is some sort of interference, if you will. Israel borrowed what was compatible with Yahwism and gave it new meaning. Israel is known for borrowing from all around the different nations. And then it gives it a new meaning as far as things go. Very simply, the pastoral shepherding feasts ultimately become Passover. Of the people around become Passover. The agricultural feasts of the people around become unleavened bread. And so you have Passover unleavened bread. Again, many things become borrowed from various different groups. The early cult centered on annual feasts, the unleavened bread. The agricultural feast, Passover, the pastoral feast, joined together to commemorate the Exodus and Sinai, and the freedom from Egypt. The Feast of Weeks basically comes together. The ingathering, or tabernacles, which basically celebrates the end of the harvest period, where you go out and sleep in tents. The Feast of Weeks also, I think, is known as Pentecost, which celebrates the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. And so what Israel does is it takes the various cultural annual feasts of the people around it, and it Judaizes them. I can't say baptizes them, because it doesn't necessarily, and it sounds strange to say it circumcises them. So I'll say it, they Judaize them, and they make them then fit into their past history. And so, Exodus, Sinai, and actually there's another connection too with tabernacles. It's leaving me right now. The festivals then are places where the mighty acts of God can be celebrated. What has God done for us, basically? What has God done for us? Passover celebrates the Exodus. Week celebrates the giving of the law on Sinai, as I mentioned. Ingathering celebrates the covenant renewal at Shechem. So notice the major pieces that I've shown you earlier on today now get ritualized in the various feasts and celebrations. And there's that text of Deuteronomy 26 that I read to you earlier on about the wandering Aramean. So, when Israel gets into the Canaanite area, there's a period of adaptation, adjustment, and consolidation. And Israel basically transitions. Up to getting into the land, they're wandering. So they can't really settle. When they get into the land, they settle, and so they move from a more shepherding, cowboy mode to a more farmer mode. Now, if you're familiar with Oklahoma, there has to be a point where the farmer and the cowboy can be friends. Both
of these modes don't deal with each other well. And so Israel goes from a more cowboy mode, pastoral shepherding, to an agricultural farming mode. The implication is the pastoral shepherd is one who's wandering, the farmer is one who's settled. Okay? And so they settle an agrarian life and they become a nation of farmers, and they enter into tension with the religion of the people who are already there. Because they want to grow their crops, and how do you grow the crops? Well, what do? Well, we offer sacrifice to Baal. Well, we can't offer sacrifice to Baal because Yahweh's our only God. Well, if you don't, you're not going to get rain, and if you don't get rain, you're not going to get crops, and so on. So the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Baal become confused, overall. And the Baal worship is one of the things that Israel has real problems with, because it shows up all over the place. They keep bumping into it. They're trying to avoid it, but they keep bumping into it, as you see it developing. So, what goes on then? The judges, the last group here we want to talk about, they arose to save Israel. Remember when I said that there was in this Amphictyony somebody to attack, then they cry out, then God would save them. He'd save them by raising up a judge. And then the judge would gather the people together, throw out the various different attackers, and peace would return until they did something wrong again. And they'd cry out, or God would punish, and they'd cry out, another judge would throw out, peace would reign until they did something wrong again. And so, the judges are not men of identical character. In fact, they're not all men. Believe it or not, we've got women judges. Deborah, good old Deborah, was a judge and listed, in terms of things. So here's that cycle. Idolatry and evil, oppression, cry for deliverance, deliverer, a judge, peace until the deliverer dies, idolatry, and we just keep going around the circle. Will they ever learn? Will they ever learn? That's the book of Judges. Here are your judges. Othniel, the oppressors of the Mesopotamians. Ehud, the Moabites. Shamgar. Deborah, there we go. The Canaanites. And Deborah's the only woman involved in the whole thing. But Deborah with Barak, and then we have the famous story of when Deborah and Barak are out fighting and whatnot. We have the great story of Jael and Sisera, where Jael drives a tent peg through the head of Sisera, the great general. So this very calm little woman who kills the great general because he goes to her house. He wants water, she gives him milk. He wants bread, she gives him meat. He wants sleep, and she gives him a tent peg. So there's a great painting of Caravaggio, I think, in Italy, in the Barberini Palace, of Jael and Sisera. Now, oddly enough, why in the name of heavens would that be of interest to me? When I was in 7th grade, we had this, I don't know how many of you ever had that Brown Bible Stories book, but we had the Bible Stories book, and we went through that story, and it stuck with me forever and ever and ever. But notice who the last of the judges is. The last of the judges is Samson, the great strong man. So common to all judges then, they had the Spirit of Yahweh upon them. They had God's Spirit. So they were charismatic. And they rallied the clans against some sort of a foe. So the tribal system then was a loose form of government. Reuben ends up being rubbed out almost by Moabite aggression. Dan ends up being destroyed practically by the Philistines. The tribal system couldn't enforce the purity of Yahwism because there was so much infiltration from outside. They couldn't prevent tribal rivalry. And so, but here there really was not much thought of trying to unite at this stage of the game. They were looking towards, but eventually, toward the end of the Amphictyonic period, they want to see how a monarchy can develop. We did it. So that's highlights of, the first of those 6 chapters. I think rather major highlights. I think I covered everything that's pretty important.
And next week we'll do David, Solomon, the split of the kingdom. Maybe we will do the northern kingdom. Maybe I'll get Jezebel in there. I got to talk to you about Jezebel. Yes, if you'd hand in those other sheets to me, I'd appreciate that, and I'll hold them and give them back to you.